All right, today we are going to be looking at economic solutions to the Great Depression. So please note that all unit work is due Friday and your unit exam is the following week. Your essential question for today is what political solutions were proposed to overcome the economic issues of the Great Depression? As you are writing this question down, what I'd like you to do is to grab your economic scenarios from the other day. And I want you to grab the hard copies, right? The ones that actually have the um, problem on it and then uh, gives you the question, and you had to pick A, B, or C. I asked you on that paper to circle or to identify A, B, or C, or A or B, or whatever that looked like for you. So what I'd like you to do right now is to tally up the number of A's you have, tally up the number of B's you have, and to tally up the number of C's you have. So go ahead and press pause as you tally. Okay, hopefully you've done that. And because it's kind of like, I don't know, one of those old magazine quizzes where the letters that you select kind of speak a little bit about what you value and what you think is a potential solution through economic crisis. It's not necessarily specific to this economic crisis. I think actually a lot of these ideas can be implemented in any economic crisis. So we're going to look at that a little bit. So make sure you have that page handy. Side note, if you're hearing some noise, that's my dog. She really enjoys being near wherever I make videos. So let's take a look at some of these. So if you picked more A's than anything, that really means that you fall on the side of being a conservative when at least it comes to economic issues. That may not apply in other issues like social issues, and we'll spend more time talking about some of that in your civics and government class next year. But largely, this is what we're talking about is economics. And so if you pick mostly A's, this kind of means that you are more of an economic conservative. You can see on the screen that what that really translates into is that as an economic conservative, you really believe that the best way to solve an economic crisis is to continue to give tax relief, right? Which means reducing taxes, to provide more loans, to both individuals and to business. And that's going to help encourage business. You want to encourage business because as a conservative, you believe that business is the way to trigger the market, right? Like if you can have more businesses, you can have effective businesses, that's going to help employment. You believe that business prosperity and the accumulation of wealth at the top is going to trickle down to those in need of creating more jobs. We actually call that trickle down economic theory. You believe in discouraging federal aid to the poor. You wouldn't be a fan of giving direct money to people in poverty. Instead, you would much rather see private charities and local and state governments actually organize to provide poverty relief. As an economic conservative, you would believe that it's important to balance the budget because you see that as a way to create stability in the marketplace and in the economy. You would believe that you should voluntarily, not compel, but ask for cooperation from businesses to stabilize wages and hours in an average workday. As an economic conservative, you probably wouldn't be a fan of minimum wage because you believe that businesses should be free to increase their wages or decrease their wages as they wish. As an economic conservative, you would believe that it is the job to increase the federal government's commitment to public works. Economic problems are just kind of part of the business cycle. It happens kind of every 14 years. The economy goes up and down, and that's natural. And so as a result, the economy is just going to bounce back. It's going to buoy. And by doing so, you're going to increase public confidence. Having some strategies in place to do that is what you would believe as an economic conservative. And then lastly, you would be a fan of tariffs. Economic conservatives tend to be a fan of tariffs because they believe that it is going to keep American businesses afloat. So as an economic conservative, these are the strategies that you would probably use in order to improve some of the problems of the Great Depression. Now, if you largely picked B, you would likely fall as an economic liberal. Again, not a social liberal, but an economic liberal. So, what does that mean? It means that you think that maybe the better way through things is to increase taxes on the income of the wealthy and corporations. You want to tax heavily those with the most wealth because you believe that you could collect a larger tax base. You would like to directly provide relief to the poor from the federal government, like cutting a check from the government to individual people directly without like a middleman. You would believe that you should make a massive federal commitment to public works, like building roads and bridges, et cetera. And that money comes from the federal government, and that's what you would believe in. And you believe that the federal government should be planning some of this work, and they should work with industry leaders to plan economic activity. And you believe that you should provide direct aid to farmers in the forms of loans and payments to take crops out of production until prices could stabilize. What we call that in the modern era is subsidies, farm subsidies. Literally the government providing a check to individuals as a way to prevent a surplus of goods. So as an economic liberal, that's what you would believe. Lastly, if you picked if you picked C, then you're largely more of a radical, right? You want to take the income and property of individuals and redistribute it so that everybody has access. You would rather have the government make decisions instead of private business owners, and you want the government to control businesses. As an economic radical, you would want to make sure every person has a job, and you would guarantee employment to all workers through government control of industries. And lastly, you would rather reorganize farming instead of having individuals kind of privately farm. You'd like them to almost be like corporate farmers. They're cooperative, they're working together, and that's going to prevent competition. As an economic radical, you wouldn't necessarily be a fan of competition in the marketplace. So as you think back to A, B, or C, right, these are all personal choices. It's not that one is wrong or one is right. It's what's right for you and how you see things coming together in the economy, or at least solutions to some of these problems in the economy, right? A, B, or C. So you kind of know what your choices were. So now we're going to kind of match them to people and some of the solutions. So I want to look at some of the solutions in particular, and we're going to attach them to presidencies. So I want to look a little bit at Herbert Hoover. And this is Herbert Hoover. I've mentioned his name before. He was elected in 1928, and he serves as president from 1929 to 1933, and he is a Republican. I want to highlight for you a little bit the election of 1928. I think this tends to get lost a little bit in the story about Hoover. So this is the 1928 election, and you can see Herbert Hoover. This is the electoral map. It's not necessarily the popular map, although you can see popular votes on here. But this is the 28 election between Hoover and Al Smith. And Al Smith was a Democrat. Hoover's the Republican. And I think you can see fairly clearly that Hoover won this election by a landslide, right? He wins a good portion of the United States. Smith wins a little bit of the South, and that's about the gist of it. Hoover wins by a landslide in terms of popular votes, too. The popular vote is when people like you and I vote. So we can see that Hoover wins 21 million and Al Smith wins 15 million. A 6 million vote differential is pretty significant. So Hoover kind of enters into 1929 really as a very, very popular individual. However, things don't stay that way. And it's not necessarily because of his approach. I want to be clear. We're not saying that his approach was the wrong approach. I don't think that's a fair statement on Hoover. I think instead what we identify is that Hoover may not have had enough time to keep his approach actually, solving problems, or that, his individuals who were advising him needed to shift things along the way. So Hoover is got a conservative approach. And because we know what that means to have a conservative approach, we can look back at that earlier slide I had, and it would make more sense now as to what he is hoping to do. So he really believes in what's called rugged individualism. I think that's a really important concept for you to understand and to make sure you highlight in your notes. Rugged individualism is this belief that you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? Like that you are responsible for yourself, that nobody else is responsible for you. And as a result, it's your responsibility to pull yourself out of these economic situations that you're in. And Hoover was kind of that guy. It's why he has that approach. He was orphaned at a young age, worked himself through school, went to Stanford, gets a degree in engineering, goes and studies in China. In fact, he spoke Mandarin Chinese with his spouse. Like, this is his just, philosophy on things. He works in government during the World War I. He's involved in making sure there's enough food for soldiers. Like, he has this really strong philosophy that, like, if he could do it, you could do it too. And we all know people who are inspirational like that, right? Who've had big challenges and they pull themselves up and they can prove that they can do these great things. Hoover's that guy. That's what he believes, because that's his story. And so that's what rugged individualism is. And so he sees that as a solution. He feels people should find that sense of pride in the hard work, and that's going to get them through. He does, however, understand that sometimes you just need additional help. But he felt it was not government's responsibility to help people. He thought there's enough charities and religious organizations that if you need help, you could go to one of those organizations and that they could provide that help to you. He just didn't think it was the responsibility of government to directly assist people. Instead, he thought if government could directly assist business and industry, then they could assist people, right? Like, if the US government made it cheaper for companies to borrow money, or they could give them direct infusions of cash, again, to the business, then that would trickle down eventually to workers. Businesses could hire more workers, or the workers that exist could receive higher wages. That's his thinking. And we still see some of that thinking, of course, in the modern economy today. There's lots of presidents who embrace that concept. It is during Hoover's approach that the Hawley-Smoot tariff increases. He's president when that happens. It's Congress that does that, right? They're the ones who actually create the tariff bills. And he's the president who signs it in. He really thought that that tariff was going to fix things and help American business kind of keep going. He is president when the Dawes Act occurs, which we talked about previously. And as a potential solution, he comes up with what's called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, which basically was giving money from the government to businesses like railroads and banks, et cetera. Like, with the idea, infuse those industries, the money will trickle down to the workers. By 1932, which is an election year, he proposes a public works project. Public works are what we call things like bridges and roads, things that you and I benefit from, but we don't have to pay for. We don't have to buy our own dam or buy our own bridge. Like, we invest in it by giving taxpayer dollars. And we all get to use it. So that's what public works are. And so he came up with this idea that a dam should be built on the Colorado River. And the dam is called Boulder Dam. Today we call it Hoover Dam. And in 1932, construction began on trying to harness the Colorado River. By creating the dam, it was going to be a hydroelectric dam. It could create power to parts of the American Southwest. And fun fact, that's one of the reasons why Vegas is really springs up as a town, because it gets electrified because of the energy that comes from Hoover Dam. So this is Herbert Hoover's approach to how to solve some of the problems of the Depression. But Hoover faced challenges, right? Things weren't immediately getting better. And for Hoover, he takes this very personally. He's a very spiritual, religious man. He takes it quite personal that things aren't improving. He's kind of going to what he knows should be working, and it doesn't seem to immediately get better in the economy. And you see here, this is an image. In fact, he lends his name to what are called Hoovervilles. This is a Hooverville in Seattle from 1937, because it's nicknamed because people said, hey, Hoover put us here. Hoover really just didn't think that the Depression would last as long as it had. There have been very, very few times in American history where depressions, economic downturns had been as bad as 3 years. He's 3 years into it by 1932. He thought, hey, things would bounce back by now. I've tried all the, what we know, all the tricks of the trade, all the plays in the playbook, and things weren't improving. Furthermore, a situation happens in 1932, which makes things worse. And that's called the Bonus Army March. So the Bonus Army March really begins in the summer of 1932. And in 1932, Congress was looking at whether they should pass a bill that would give a payment, like a stipend or really a bonus, to those who had served in World War I. Now, in fact, actually, a bill had been passed to give a stipend to veterans of World War I prior to 1932, right? This is earlier in the 1920s. But there was really no money to kind of pay that bonus. And so by 1932, things are really dire for workers in America. And these folks that were members of the American Expeditionary Force, these soldiers who'd fought in Europe, they were a really tough position. And so they kind of pushed the idea to Congress that maybe you could pay out our bonus now. So the House of Representatives actually entertained the idea of paying out the bonus immediately, like figuring out the cash to pay these soldiers, hoping it would like create an infusion of money into the economy. However, so the members of the bonus army decide, I'm going to just show up to Washington, D.C. to like physically show my support, to demonstrate how much I really want Congress to pass this bill. So members of the bonus, that now they're called the bonus army, right? But there's these former World War I soldiers show up to Washington, D.C. because heck, what else do they have to lose? They're living in, shanties. They're really, really struggling economically. And so why not go to Washington, D.C. and like show your level of support? So they show up to Washington, D.C. They encamp all around like the White House and grounds outside of Congress, a place called Anacostia Flats. And they stay there for the summer. And honestly, for quite a period of time, like Hoover and Hoover's wife went out and visited with the veterans. So the bill passes the House and it goes to the Senate in the summer of 1932. Remember, 32 is an election year. And it fails in the Senate. It absolutely fails. And frankly, it's because there's no money to pay these people. There's no money to give them as a bonus. And the senators are very realistic and they know they don't have the cash to do so. And so the bill fails. And the bonus army, right, these veterans from World War I are now in a situation where they're stuck in Washington, D.C. They had hoped to get a bonus. I don't know what they were thinking, if they'd get like paid out immediately or what that would look like. But now they're in Washington, D.C. and they really don't have a reason to be there. So they continue to stay and are essentially kind of homeless in the city. Hoover is frustrated. He understood why they were there, but he doesn't want them to stay in Washington, D.C. And the camps start growing a lot of frustration with government. And, there's a sort of tension that is existing. And so we don't really know the entire story of how it went down exactly, because there's two different perspectives on what was said. However, what ends up happening is either Hoover orders, which is what the general says, or according to Hoover, he just muttered it. He wasn't giving an order. But nonetheless, Douglas MacArthur, who will later on be a general during World War II. But MacArthur aided with a young man, a young officer by the name of George Patton, and another young officer by the name of Dwight Eisenhower, later to be President Eisenhower, end up gathering what military men they have in Washington, D.C. And they enter the camps. They come with the army into the camps. And initially, right, the members of the camp are ecstatic to see them, right? These are current soldiers. The camps are made up of veterans. And so we know that from the record that people who were there that day said they cheered. They were excited to see the military. But what happened wasn't something so cheerful, because the current members of the U.S. Army ended up removing the campsites. We know that there's fire at the camp because we see lots of pictures of flames and some of the imagery from the time. And there's some sort of exchange of gunfire. There are limited fatalities at this event. There are more who are wounded, but nonetheless, it looks like, just optics alone, it looks like America's army has turned on its veterans. Again, Hoover claims, I didn't order this. I had nothing to do with this. This is MacArthur with Patton and Eisenhower doing whatever they want. Hoover just firmly believes that that's the case. MacArthur said, listen, I would never have brought the entire military or the US Army at the time, which isn't big. I want to be clear about that. They don't have a standing army in 1932. But nonetheless, I wouldn't have brought the army into this encampment if the commander in chief had not ordered me to do so, right? Regardless, nonetheless, the event happens and the optics are bad. They're really bad. And it's an election year. So let's look at the 1932 election. Okay, so we've looked at 1928. Let's look at 1932. In 1932, Hoover runs against the Democratic governor from New York. His name is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, as he's popularly known, is in fact Theodore Roosevelt's second cousin. So they are related. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. Franklin D. Roosevelt is a Democrat. But this is the 1932 election. And you can see how this election plays out, right? Visuals are pretty obvious. Franklin Roosevelt wins this election by a landslide, and by over electoral votes by a landslide, but also 7 million popular vote difference. So what do we do with that? I think one of our biggest takeaways is for us to acknowledge that Hoover's approach is not a bad approach. I want to be really clear about that type of approach to how to solve problems of the of economic downturns. The word, they didn't use the word depression at the time. They would have called it a recession or a downturn. But nonetheless, those solutions had worked in the past. I think so often people blame Hoover for the Great Depression. Hoover is not at fault for the Great Depression. What is at fault are those causes that we looked at previously. Hoover's tried to alleviate them, but those causes there's so many different issues that are going on at the time. It's really, really hard for him to come up with some sort of solution that fixes everything that's wrong in America at that time. It's not that Franklin Roosevelt can fix it either. I think so often in history, we pit one versus the other. And I don't think that's fair. I think instead it's better to say that it's not that Franklin Roosevelt got us out of the Depression. It's that Roosevelt had some other strategies. Oh, and by the way, there's some other issues that are going on. We're going to talk about World War II that kind of helps improve the economy as well. So I think as we bring things back here to wrap up, we have looked at Hoover's solutions. We've looked at 3 different approaches: the conservative approach, the liberal approach, and the radical approach. And what I'm going to do is I really am going to have us pause here with Franklin Roosevelt, because we're going to talk a little bit more about him tomorrow, and we will understand that, in fact, his approach is going to be more akin to that of the liberal approach. So while Hoover tends to favor more of a conservative approach, Franklin Roosevelt tends to favor more of a liberal approach. By the way, there are those who were more supportive of the radical approach, and we'll talk about them a little bit later on too. Those are going to be critics of Franklin Roosevelt because they don't think he's doing enough. So we're going to stop there. Hopefully you're able to pick up this material. Of course, you're able to slow it down as need be. Those are always options on the table for you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Oh, by the way, here's my dog.